At 23:45 on October 19, 1942, Lieutenant Robert Lynch crouched behind the wheel of PT-48, watching three Japanese Daihatsu barges cut through the black water off Cape Esperance. The young officer was just 26 years old, but had already completed 14 night patrols without a single confirmed kill to show for his efforts. The barges carried 60 troops each, along with ammunition destined to reinforce Guadalcanal, and each vessel was equipped with a Type 92 heavy machine gun and steel plate armor thick enough to stop rifle rounds. Lynch's PT boat carried 4 Mark 8 torpedoes, each weighing over 2,000 pounds with a 466-pound TNT warhead. But the minimum depth setting for those torpedoes was 10 feet, while the Japanese barges drew only 5 feet of water. His torpedoes would pass directly underneath the targets without ever causing damage. By mid-October 1942, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had lost 6 boats in the waters around Guadalcanal. 17 sailors had died following a pattern that seemed inescapable. PT boats detected Japanese barge convoys, PT boats attempted torpedo runs, the torpedoes missed because they were calibrated for deeper targets, the barges returned fire with their heavy machine guns, and the PT boats either burned or withdrew. The twin .50 caliber Browning machine guns mounted on PT-48 could fire 850 rounds per minute, devastating against wooden fishing boats, but completely ineffective against armored Daihatsu barges, where the .50 caliber rounds merely sparked off the steel plate and accomplished nothing. Japanese forces ran supply missions down the slot every single night, a pattern the Americans grimly called the Tokyo Express. Destroyers and fast cruisers brought troops, ammunition, and food under cover of darkness, and when American aircraft made destroyer runs too dangerous, the Japanese simply switched to barges that were slower, smaller, harder to detect, and frustratingly immune to PT boat torpedoes. Squadron commanders at Tulagi were desperate for solutions, and crews tried everything they could think of. Some mounted single-shot Army M3 37mm anti-tank guns on their bows, removing the wheels and lashing the guns to timber planks, but these weapons offered only one shot before requiring a manual reload in the middle of combat, which was better than nothing, but far from effective. PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant John Kennedy, mounted an M3 anti-tank gun the night before a patrol in August, and while the gun worked, sort of, Kennedy's crew could fire one round and then had to reload manually, while Japanese machine guns raked their boat, which was simply not sustainable. The real problem was mathematics. A Daihatsu barge could carry 60 fully armed troops or 8 tons of supplies, and the Japanese were running 20 to 30 barges per night past Guadalcanal. PT boats had to sink multiple barges per patrol to actually disrupt the supply lines, and single-shot guns simply could not accomplish that mission. Henderson Field sat 3 miles inland from Lunga Point, the airfield that Marines had captured on August 7th, and by October the field had become a graveyard of wrecked aircraft. Wrecked planes lined the runway apron in twisted metal rows. Japanese bombing raids hit Henderson almost daily with Betty bombers and Zero fighters, and the Americans scrambled everything they could fly, including damaged P-400 Airacobras and F-4 Wildcats that often crashed on landing. Dozens of Bell P-39 Airacobra fighters sat in pieces around Henderson Field, and the Airacobra was a strange aircraft with its engine positioned behind the pilot and a propeller shaft running under the cockpit. This unusual design created space in the nose for something remarkable: a 37mm Oldsmobile M4 automatic cannon that fired through the propeller hub. The M4 cannon could fire 150 rounds per minute from a 30-round horseshoe-shaped magazine, with a muzzle velocity of 2,000 feet per second, designed to destroy light armor and aircraft with both high explosive and armor-piercing rounds. Most P-39 wrecks at Henderson were total losses with seized engines, sheared-off wings, and broken fuselages, but the cannons remained intact, along with their hydraulic recoil systems, feed mechanisms, and barrel assemblies, everything needed to make them work. On October 20th, Lynch walked Henderson Field at dawn and counted 23 wrecked Airacobras, some having been there for weeks, with mechanics having already stripped useful parts like instruments, radios, and control cables. But nobody had touched the cannons because they were aircraft weapons with no mounting points on PT boats, no doctrine for installation, and no official approval. Lynch stood next to a P-39 with its nose buried in coral, the 37mm cannon protruding from the propeller hub like a steel finger, and he did the math in his head. 150 rounds per minute from a 30-round magazine with automatic fire capability. He looked back toward the water, where PT-48 waited at the dock, and 3 mechanics from his crew were watching him, already knowing what he was thinking. At 1400 hours that afternoon, Lynch approached Commander Alan Calvert, commanding officer of Squadron 3, with a simple question and a desperate need, and by 1630, 4 PT boat crews were walking Henderson Field with cutting torches and wrenches, given until nightfall to accomplish the impossible. The Oldsmobile M4 cannon weighed 213 pounds without ammunition, with the hydraulic recoil system adding another 40 pounds and the feed mechanism another 30, for a complete gun assembly weighing approximately 280 pounds. PT-48 was an Elco 80-foot boat with a wooden hull constructed from 2 layers of 1-inch mahogany planking and a deck of 3/4-inch plywood over oak frames spaced on 2-foot centers, and Navy engineers had calculated maximum deck loading for .5 caliber machine gun turrets, but nobody had calculated loading for a 280-pound automatic cannon firing 150 rounds per minute. Technical Sergeant James Coogan had maintained P-39 aircraft at Selfridge Field in Michigan before the war, and found himself assigned to Henderson Field as an aircraft armorer in October 1942, knowing every bolt and hydraulic line in an Airacobra cannon assembly, and when Lynch's crew arrived at Henderson Field that afternoon, Coogan was the first man they found. The first P-39 they approached had taken a 20mm cannon round through the cockpit 3 weeks earlier, with the pilot dying on impact, and nobody had moved the wreck. Coogan crawled into the nose section with a wrench set and a cutting torch, finding the M4 cannon mounted to the aircraft's engine reduction gear housing with 8 high-tensile steel bolts, each requiring a 15/16-inch socket. Coogan only had a 3/4-inch socket, which was close enough in wartime. And removing the cannon required disconnecting the hydraulic recoil lines, the charging cable, the ammunition feed chute, and the firing solenoid wiring, then cutting through the engine mount. The work took 2 hours per aircraft, and with 6 hours of daylight remaining, Lynch detailed 8 men to the job, with a goal of 2 men per wreck and 4 cannons by nightfall if everything went perfectly, though nothing went perfectly at all. The second P-39 had been sitting in tropical heat for 11 days, causing hydraulic fluid to congeal in the recoil system and the charging cable to corrode. And when Coogan's team tried to remove the cannon, the mounting bolts had seized from heat expansion. Henderson Field had no penetrating oil, so they used aviation gasoline and waited 20 minutes for the bolts to come loose barely. By 1730 hours, they had removed 3 complete M4 cannon assemblies from the wrecked Airacobras, each lying on the coral beside Henderson Field's runway apron, and Coogan inspected the mechanisms to find the first cannon's hydraulic recoil cylinder showed a hairline crack, making it unusable. The second cannon's feed mechanism had a bent pawl that was repairable with a file and 30 minutes of work, and the third cannon was pristine and ready for combat.
PT boats had no mounting points designed for aircraft cannons, and the bow deck forward of the chart house was flat plywood over oak stringers, so Lynch needed a pedestal mount that could absorb recoil forces, allow 360-degree rotation, and survive the flex of a planing hull hitting waves at 40 knots. Henderson Field's machine shop consisted of one lathe, one drill press, and a welding rig powered by a diesel generator, but they had built engine mounts for damaged aircraft, repaired propeller hubs, and fabricated brackets for radios and gun cameras. So Chief Machinist Mate Donald Frey designed the mount in 40 minutes using a grease pencil on a sheet of aluminum. The design was simple because it had to be. A steel base plate 12 inches in diameter with 4 bolt holes matching PT-48's deck framing, a vertical pipe section welded to the base, a rotating collar with bearing surfaces, and a yoke to hold the cannon, all constructed from scrap steel salvaged from destroyed aircraft landing gear. Frey's team started welding at 18:15 hours, but the generator powering the arc welder kept cutting out because Henderson Field was rationing diesel fuel, so they welded in 5-minute intervals, letting the generator cool before welding again. The base plate took 40 minutes, the pipe section took 30, and the rotating collar took an hour because the bearing surfaces had to be machined smooth or the gun would bind. By 2100 hours, they had a crude pedestal mount that looked like something built in a high school shop class, with ugly welds and scorched paint, the rotating collar having 3 degrees of wobble, but it would hold a 280-pound cannon, and it would rotate, probably.
They loaded the cannon and mount onto a 6x6 truck, with 3 sailors riding in the back holding the cannon to prevent it from bouncing on the rough road down to the dock, and PT-48 waited at Tulagi across Iron Bottom Sound. The truck reached the dock at Lunga Point at 22:30 hours, and a Higgins boat ferried the equipment across the water, while Lynch waited on PT-48 with his crew, having already measured the bow deck and marked 4 mounting points, the deck frames underneath being doubled oak that might be strong enough for a .50 caliber turret, and maybe strong enough for this. They would know when they fired the first shot or when the mount ripped through the deck. Installing the base plate required drilling 4 holes through 3/4-inch plywood and 2 inches of oak framing using a hand-cranked drill that took 30 minutes per hole and 2 hours total, and by 0100 hours on October 21st, the base plate was bolted down. They lifted the cannon onto the mount, the collar fitting, the yoke holding, the cannon elevating, depressing, and rotating, not smoothly but moving, while ammunition remained an unsolved problem because the M4 cannon used a horseshoe-shaped magazine holding 30 rounds stored in the P-39's ammunition bay behind the cockpit, and PT-48 had no ammunition bay, no magazine storage, and no quick reload system, so they simply stacked 6 loaded magazines on the deck beside the gun mount, with the loader hand-feeding magazines while the gunner fired. Crude but functional, maybe. At 0200 hours on October 21, 1942, PT-48 had the first aircraft automatic cannon ever mounted on a United States Navy patrol torpedo boat, having taken 9 hours from Henderson Field salvage to installation. The gun had not been test-fired, the mount had not been stress-tested, and the crew had no training on the weapon. But none of that mattered because Japanese barges were running supplies that night. PT-48 departed Tulagi at 2200 hours on October 21st as part of a standard formation with PT-40, PT-46, and PT-60, 2 boats north of Savo Island and 2 boats patrolling the waters off Cape Esperance, with Lynch commanding PT-48 with the untested 37mm cannon mounted on his bow. Gunner's Mate Second Class Harold Mitchell volunteered to operate the cannon despite having only fired .50 caliber Browning machine guns on 12 combat patrols and never an aircraft automatic cannon, with Coogan having provided basic instructions at the dock: point, press trigger,
change magazines when empty, and the hydraulic recoil system would absorb most of the shock, probably. The night was overcast with no moon and visibility approximately 200 yards in ambient starlight, the sea calm, and PT-48 ran on 2 engines at 15 knots to reduce noise and wake signature. At 23:55 hours, PT-48's radar operator detected surface contacts bearing 320 degrees at 4,000 yards, 4 contacts moving at approximately 8 knots, consistent with Daihatsu barges running supplies down the slot. American doctrine for PT boat attacks required closing to 1,000 yards before launching torpedoes, with optimum torpedo range at 800 yards, but closer range increased hit probability while exposing the PT boat to return fire, and against barges with torpedoes that could not hit them, the doctrine was worthless. Lynch needed to get close enough for Mitchell to fire the cannon effectively. At 3,000 yards, Lynch could see the barges silhouetted against the darker water, 4 Type A Daihatsu barges in line formation, each 49 feet long with a 14-foot beam powered by a single diesel engine at maximum speed 12 knots, each carrying a Type 92 heavy machine gun amidships with troops visible on the decks as shapes in the darkness. PT-48 closed to 1,500 yards. Mitchell charged the 37mm cannon using the manual charging handle, the mechanism working with the first round seating in the chamber, and he flipped the safety off with the cannon ready to fire, though nobody knew what would happen next. At 1,000 yards, the lead Japanese barge detected PT-48, and the Type 92 machine gun opened fire with 7.7mm rounds, stitching the water 30 yards short of the PT boat. Tracer rounds drawing orange lines across the black water. Lynch maintained course, committed now, and Mitchell opened fire at 800 yards, where the 37mm cannon roared with muzzle flash lighting the entire bow deck white. The recoil drove the gun backward in its mount, the deck flexed, the pedestal mount held, and Mitchell kept his finger on the trigger as the M4 cycled at 150 rounds per minute, 2.5 rounds per second, emptying the 30-round horseshoe magazine in just 12 seconds. The high explosive rounds hit the lead barge along its waterline, each round exploding on impact. The first 3 rounds punching through the steel plate armor like cardboard, the 4th round detonating inside the troop compartment. The barge's diesel fuel tank ignited, with orange flame erupting from its center. Men jumping into the water as the barge continued forward another 50 yards burning before settling by the bow and stopping. Mitchell yanked the empty magazine off the cannon, with the horseshoe feed system coming away clean, grabbed the second magazine and slammed it onto the feed mechanism in 8 seconds, which in combat was an eternity, but it worked, while the second barge in the Japanese formation turned hard to port, attempting to break away. PT-48's helmsman followed, and Lynch closed to 600 yards, where Mitchell fired the second magazine's 30 rounds in 12 seconds, with 22 rounds hitting the barge. The barge's armor stopped the first 5 rounds, but the 6th penetrated, and the 7th found something volatile, causing the barge to explode rather than burn, the blast visible for miles as a munition cook-off disintegrated the vessel. The 3rd and 4th barges scattered, with one turning north toward Savo Island and one south toward Guadalcanal, and PT-48 pursued the southern barge as Mitchell loaded his 3rd magazine, with the mount's rotating collar binding from heat expansion, forcing him to muscle the gun to track the target as the bearing surfaces Frey had machined were already wearing under combat stress. At 700 yards, Mitchell fired the 3rd magazine, while the barge returned fire with its Type 92 machine gun, 7.7mm rounds hitting PT-48's bow, with one round punching through the plywood deck 18 inches from Mitchell's position, though he did not stop firing. The 37mm rounds walked up the barge from stern to bow, killing the engine and leaving the barge drifting without way, men abandoning into the water, though the barge did not sink. It was simply no longer combat effective. PT-48 broke off the attack at 02:20 hours, with Mitchell having fired 90 rounds from 3 magazines, the gun not jamming, the mount not failing, and the deck not collapsing. 2 Japanese barges were destroyed, 1 barge was disabled, and there were 0 American casualties. Lynch radioed Commander Calvert at Tulagi with a brief transmission. The aircraft cannon worked, and it worked better than anyone had expected. By 0300 hours, every PT boat commander in Squadron 3 was demanding an M4 cannon for his boat. But Henderson Field only had 23 wrecked Aerocrobus, and Squadron 3 had 12 operational PT boats, and the mathematics did not work. By October 23rd, 3 more PT boats had 37mm cannons mounted on their bows, PT-40, PT-46, and PT-60, with crews stripping 5 more wrecked Aerocrobus at Henderson Field in a salvage operation that became increasingly systematic as teams learned which bolts to remove first, which hydraulic lines to disconnect, and which electrical connectors to cut. The second cannon removal took 90 minutes, the third took 70, and by the fourth they had it down to 55 minutes, while the pedestal mounts improved with each installation as Chief Frey refined the design after examining PT-48's mount following the first combat action, adding bronze bushings salvaged from damaged aircraft wheel assemblies that reduced friction and made the second-generation mounts rotate smoothly under combat loading. Ammunition supply became the immediate bottleneck because Henderson Field's armory had horseshoe magazines designed for aircraft combat, where engagements lasted seconds, but PT boat actions against barges could last 20 minutes or more. Mitchell had fired 90 rounds in PT-48's first engagement, and the boat carried 6 magazines for 180 rounds total, not enough. So aviation ordnance personnel at Henderson Field loaded magazines around the clock, with each magazine requiring hand-loading 30 rounds individually, taking 8.
The high-explosive rounds proved devastatingly effective against Daihatsu barges, designed to destroy light aircraft structures with thin aluminum and magnesium components, working even better against the quarter-inch steel plate armor on Japanese barges, with each round that penetrated creating a 12-inch hull and spraying shrapnel through the interior. 2 or 3 hits could disable a barge, while 5 to 8 hits would sink it, and PT-40 engaged 3 barges off Kimbo Bay on October 24th with its newly installed M4 cannon, destroying 2 barges in the first magazine's 30 rounds over 20 seconds, with both barges burning and sinking within 2 minutes. While the third barge escaped in darkness, the radio intercepts suggested it took damage. Squadron 3 was learning that the 37mm cannon changed PT boat tactics fundamentally because before the cannon, PT boats attempted torpedo runs at 800 to 1,000 yards, with torpedoes missing shallow draft barges and PT boats withdrawing. But with the cannon, PT boats could close to 400 yards and destroy barges with direct fire. The closer range increased danger from Japanese return fire, but eliminated the problem of torpedoes passing underneath targets, and Japanese commanders noticed the change immediately, with radio intercepts from October 25th indicating barge crews were reporting PT boats with heavy cannon and explosive shells, using the phrase "demon boats with aircraft guns," creating significant psychological impact as Japanese barge crews who had operated with relative impunity for weeks were now being destroyed before delivering supplies.
By November 1, 1942, 8 PT boats in Squadron 3 operated with salvaged 37mm cannons, Henderson Field having been stripped of every usable M4 cannon from wrecked P-39 aircraft, with 21 cannons total removed and 17 in service on PT boats, while 4 were held as spares for maintenance. The maintenance requirements were substantial because the M4 cannon was designed for aircraft service with extensive ground crew support between missions, but PT boats operated for days at forward bases with minimal maintenance facilities where saltwater corroded hydraulic recoil systems, tropical heat degraded rubber seals, and coral dust invaded feed mechanisms. Gunners' mates learned to field strip and maintain the weapons with improvised tools, and Technical Sergeant Coogan transferred from Henderson Field to Tulagi in early November, specifically to support PT boat cannon maintenance, establishing a small workshop in a corrugated metal shed near the PT boat dock with a workbench, vise, and basic hand tools, training PT boat gunners' mates on cannon disassembly, cleaning, and reassembly in 3-day courses that by mid-November meant every PT boat with a cannon had at least one crew member who could maintain it. The success of the field modification reached higher commands quickly, and Commander Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron South Pacific reviewed after-action reports showing 8 patrols with 23 Japanese barges engaged, 14 barges destroyed, 6 barges damaged, and 0 PT boats lost, the 37mm cannon proving itself statistically. On November 18th, Commander Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron South Pacific sent a classified confidential dispatch to Bureau of Ordnance in Washington detailing the field modification, describing combat results, and requesting official approval for installation with formal procurement of M4 cannons for PT boat use, including technical drawings of the pedestal mount design, ammunition consumption data, and maintenance requirements. Bureau of Ordnance received the dispatch on November 23rd, and the bureaucratic process that followed would normally take months for design review, safety analysis, procurement planning, and production scheduling, but the combat results from Guadalcanal were undeniable. On December 7, 1942, exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor, Bureau of Ordnance authorized production of standardized pedestal mounts for M4 cannons on PT boats, manufactured by a contractor in Rhode Island, with an initial production run of 100 units and a 90-day delivery timeline. But PT boats in the South Pacific needed the cannons now, not in 90 days. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 6 arrived at Tulagi in mid-December 1942 with 12 boats and fresh crews, having standard armament of twin .50 caliber turrets and 20mm Ehrlichen cannons, but no 37mm aircraft guns, having deployed expecting to fight with torpedoes, only to find Squadron 3 destroying barges with salvaged cannons. Squadron 6's commanding officer requested immediate cannon installation, but Henderson Field had no more wrecked P-39 aircraft to salvage, with every flyable Airacobra in service with the 13th Air Force, and commanders could not strip guns from operational aircraft. The solution came from New Caledonia in November, when a cargo ship arrived carrying replacement parts for damaged P-39 fighters, including 12 complete M4 cannon assemblies, new and factory fresh, still packed in Cosmoline preservative and intended for aircraft repair. PT boat commanders wanted them instead, and the requisition process became creative, with cannons officially signed out for P-39 maintenance at Henderson Field, but unofficially never reaching the airfield, instead a Catalina flying boat transporting them directly to Tulagi. By December 20th, Squadron 6 was installing the new cannons on their boats with proper installation, using the improved pedestal mount design. The difference between salvaged cannons and new cannons immediately apparent, as salvaged cannons from Henderson Field showed wear, with degraded hydraulic seals, damaged feed mechanisms, and worn barrel rifling, while the new cannons from New Caledonia were pristine, with smooth hydraulic systems and perfectly cycling feed mechanisms. By January 1943, 24 PT boats operating in the Solomon Islands had 37mm cannons, with Squadron 3's 8 boats, Squadron 6's 12 boats, and Squadron 2's 4 boats, spreading the barge-busting capability across the entire PT boat force in the South Pacific. Japanese supply operations faced systematic destruction, with combat reports from January documenting 37 PT boat patrols engaging Japanese barges, 41 barges destroyed, 29 barges damaged, and 8 barges escaped. More importantly, PT boat losses decreased dramatically from September through November, when Squadron 3 lost 6 boats, to December through February with cannons installed, when only 2 boats were lost, neither loss attributed to barge engagements. The tactical doctrine evolved rapidly, with PT boats learning to attack barges in pairs, one boat closing to 400 yards to engage with the 37mm cannon, while the second boat provided suppressive fire with .50 caliber machine guns and stood by for torpedo shots if larger vessels appeared. Japanese adaptation came with barge convoys traveling with destroyer escorts who engaged PT boats at long range with 5-inch guns, while barges scattered. But PT boats could not fight destroyers effectively with the 37mm cannon, devastating against barges, yet ineffective against destroyers with 3-inch armor plate, causing tactical balance to shift again, with commanders requesting heavier weapons like 40mm Bofors guns and 3-inch deck guns that weigh substantially more than the M4 cannon and require major structural modifications taking months and requiring boats to return to stateside shipyards. The compromise was improved ammunition, with Bureau of Ordnance developing a new armor-piercing round for the 37mm cannon using a tungsten carbide penetrator designed to defeat light armor at close range, not sufficient for destroyer armor but effective against Japanese patrol boats and subchasers, reaching Tulagi in February 1943 in limited quantities of 60 rounds per boat, reserved for encounters with armored targets. Meanwhile, stateside production of standardized cannon mounts continued, with the contractor in Rhode Island completing the first 50 mounts in February and shipping to the Pacific in March. But by the time they arrived, PT boat crews in the Solomon Islands had already fabricated and installed over 30 field-expedient mounts, the factory mounts being better engineered, with stronger welds and precision machining, though serving the same function as the improvised mounts built in Henderson Field's machine shop months earlier. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 8 deployed to New Guinea in March 1943, operating along the northern coast, supporting MacArthur's advance, where Japanese forces used barges extensively to move troops between bases, the same tactical problem that existed at Guadalcanal, with PT boats having torpedoes that could not hit shallow draft targets. Squadron 8 arrived equipped with 37mm cannons as standard armament, with factory mounts, new M4 cannons, and adequate ammunition supplies, the field modification from Guadalcanal having become official equipment and validating the cannon's effectiveness in different conditions of narrower waters, more restricted maneuver space, and heavier jungle canopy providing cover for barges. Squadron 8 destroyed over 60 Japanese barges in their first 3 months of operations, the cannon working in New Guinea exactly as it worked in the Solomons, reliable, effective, and deadly. By June 1943, Bureau of Ordnance authorized development of an improved cannon specifically for naval use, the 37mm M9, with longer barrel, higher muzzle velocity, and heavier construction to
The first M9 cannons reached the Pacific in October 1943, with Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 15 receiving 24 weapons for installation requiring reinforced deck structures because of the additional weight, with naval architects designing strengthened mounting points with steel plate backing under the plywood deck, adding 200 pounds of structural reinforcement per boat. Testing the M9 revealed immediate advantages, with higher muzzle velocity extending effective range to 1,000 yards compared to the M4's 600 yards, meaning PT boats could engage barges before entering effective range of Japanese return fire for fewer American casualties and more successful engagements. By January 1944, the 37mm cannon had become standard factory equipment on PT boats, with Elco Naval Division installing M9 cannons on boats during construction at their Bayonne, New Jersey facility, and Higgins Industries in New Orleans doing the same. New PT boats rolling off production lines with cannons already mounted, properly engineered, structurally sound, and fully integrated into the boat's design. The field modification from Henderson Field had taken 18 months to become official doctrine, from October 1942 to January 1944, from salvaged aircraft parts to factory standard equipment, demonstrating how successful field innovations could transform naval operations when commanders documented results and higher headquarters listened. Squadron commanders in the Mediterranean requested 37mm cannons for their boats in early 1944, with PT boats operating off Italy facing similar problems to those in the Pacific, as German F-lighters and Italian MAS boats used shallow draft hulls and American torpedoes missed or passed underneath. Motor torpedo boat squadrons 22 and 29 receiving M9 cannons in March 1944. The Mediterranean tactical environment differed significantly from the Pacific, with narrower seas, more concentrated enemy defenses, and heavier coastal artillery. But the cannon's fundamental effectiveness remained unchanged, with high rate of fire and explosive rounds effective against lightly armored targets. Mediterranean PT boats engaged German convoys off the Italian coast throughout spring and summer 1944, with the cannons proving equally effective against German vessels as they had against Japanese barges. One engagement off Anzio in April demonstrated the weapon's capability when PT-208 engaged 4 German F-lighters attempting to evacuate troops from the beachhead, destroying 2 lighters and damaging a third in a 15-minute engagement with 120 rounds expended. The return to the Philippines in October 1944 brought PT boats back to the same waters where the war had started for them nearly 3 years earlier, with motor torpedo boat squadrons operating in Leyte Gulf supporting the invasion, as Japanese forces used every available vessel to move reinforcements, including barges, small freighters, and fishing boats. PT boats with 37mm cannons systematically destroyed this traffic, and November 1944 statistics documented the cannon's cumulative impact, with 36 PT boats on patrol engaging 87 Japanese vessels, destroying 63, damaging 19, and allowing only 5 to escape, all with minimal losses of 2 boats damaged by coastal artillery and 0 boats lost to surface action. By late 1944, PT boats operated with standardized weapons loads of 1 M9 37mm cannon forward, 1 40mm bow gun aft, multiple .50 caliber machine gun positions, and rocket launchers, transforming from torpedo platforms into heavily armed gunboats, with the transformation beginning with that first salvaged aircraft cannon on PT-48 2 years earlier. Production numbers reflected the weapon's success, with Colt manufacturing over 1,500 M9 cannons between August 1943 and August 1945, not all going to PT boats, as some equipped landing craft, patrol craft, and coastal defense installations, but PT boats received priority allocation because combat results justified the weapons the boats needed. By early 1945, Japanese barge traffic in the Philippines had essentially ceased, not because the Japanese stopped trying to move supplies, but because PT boats destroyed barges faster than the Japanese could replace them. The 37mm cannon created a tactical situation where shallow draft supply vessels could not survive, Japanese forces resorting to more expensive and less efficient submarine supply runs and night flights. The final major PT boat operation occurred in Borneo in June 1945, with Australian and American forces invading Brunei Bay and PT boats providing fire support and anti-barge patrols, though Japanese resistance was lighter than expected, with few barges to engage, as the war was ending, but PT boats stood ready with their cannons. August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered,
and the war ended. Of the 531 PT boats that served during World War II, 99 were lost to enemy action, accidents, or weather, while 432 survived, with nearly all of them carrying 37mm cannons, the weapon that began as field improvisation, having become defining armament. Post-war analysis by the Navy's Bureau of Ships examined PT boat effectiveness across all theaters from 1942 through 1945, with thousands of patrols and hundreds of engagements revealing a clear pattern. PT boats equipped with 37mm cannons achieved significantly higher kill rates and lower casualty rates than boats without the weapons. The statistics were definitive, with PT boats operating October 1943 through September 1944 without cannons, destroying an average of 0.3 Japanese vessels per patrol, while PT boats operating October 1943 through August 1945 with cannons destroyed an average of 1.8 vessels per patrol, 6 times more effective. American casualties reflected the same pattern, with PT boat crew losses in the Solomon Islands campaign from August through September 1942 averaging 4.2 sailors per week, while October 1942 through February 1943 after cannon installation averaged 1.7 sailors per week, a 60% reduction. The total number of Japanese vessels destroyed by PT boats with 37mm cannons exceeded 800 confirmed kills, including barges, small freighters, patrol boats, sub-chasers, and landing craft, the majority being Datsu-class barges that carried 60 troops or 8 tons of supplies, meaning 800 barges destroyed meant 48,000 troops that never reached their destinations, or 6,000 tons of ammunition and food that never arrived.
Lieutenant Robert Lynch survived the war, commanding PT-48 through the entire Solomon Islands campaign, with 15 months of combat operations, 47 patrols, and 19 confirmed kills, receiving the Navy Cross for actions in November 1942, with the citation specifically mentioning the innovation of mounting aircraft cannons on PT boats. He returned to civilian life in Philadelphia, worked as an electrical engineer, and died in 1978, never speaking publicly about the cannon modification. Technical Sergeant James Coogan transferred from Henderson Field to Tulagi and spent the remainder of the war maintaining PT boat cannons, training over 200 gunner's mates on M4 and M9 maintenance procedures, remaining in the Air Force after the war and retiring as a master sergeant in 1962, while keeping detailed maintenance logs that documented every cannon removed from wrecked aircraft, every modification made, and every combat malfunction and repair, logs that survived and reside in the National Archives. Chief Machinist's mate Donald Frey designed the original pedestal mount in Henderson Field's machine shop, with his crude design becoming the basis for factory production mounts manufactured 18 months later, though he received no recognition for the innovation during the war, remaining at Henderson Field until December 1943 before transferring to Pearl Harbor for submarine maintenance duty and returning to Tacoma, Washington after the war to work at a shipyard until his death in 1991 at age 73. Gunner's mate second class Harold Mitchell fired the first 37mm cannon shot in anger from a PT boat on October 21, 1942, surviving that engagement and 42 more patrols before transferring to PT 109 in January 1943 as gunnery instructor, teaching crews how to operate the salvaged cannons effectively and receiving a Bronze Star for actions at Vella La Vella in August 1943 before working for Boeing in Seattle after the war until his death in 2006. The final production M9 cannon left Colt's factory in Hartford on August 10, 1945, 5 days before Japan surrendered, never seeing combat and being assigned to PT 809 stationed at Samar in the Philippines before the boat was decommissioned in October 1945 and the cannon placed in storage at Subic Bay with disposition unknown.
Of the 531 PT boats that served during World War II, only 12 survive today, with 8 preserved as museum vessels and 4 in private ownership, most retaining their 37mm cannon mounts, with some having operational M9 cannons. PT-617 at Battleship Cove in Fall River, Massachusetts, displays a functional M9 on its bow mount using the factory standard design developed from Frey's improvised pedestal at Henderson Field. And the weapon's development path was unusual for naval ordnance because most weapon systems follow a standard process of requirements identification, design specifications, prototypes, testing, production authorization, and deployment planning. The 37mm cannon on PT boats followed none of those steps, beginning with desperate crews cutting guns from crashed aircraft, welding crude mounts from scrap steel, testing the concept in combat, and proving effectiveness through results before official channels responded 18 months later from first combat use to factory installation, October 1942 to January 1944. PT boat crews in the Solomons needed the weapons in October 1942, and they got them by building the weapons themselves, with official approval coming after the innovation had already proven itself. The innovation succeeded because it solved a real tactical problem with available resources, as Japanese barges carried troops and supplies while American torpedoes could not hit them. And the wrecked aircraft at Henderson Field provided the weapon that crews simply connected to the solution. Military organizations typically resist field modifications because unauthorized equipment creates maintenance problems, non-standard installations complicate logistics, and safety concerns multiply with liability increasing, the institutional preference always favoring controlled development and approved procurement. But combat does not wait for procurement cycles, and Commander Alan Calvert authorized the first cannon installation without higher approval, taking institutional risk that if the mount had failed and killed crew members, he would have faced court-martial, or if the installation had damaged PT-48's hull, he would have answered for destroyed Navy property. He authorized it anyway because his boats needed to survive, and the results justified his decision, while Bureau of Ordnance deserves recognition for responding appropriately by evaluating combat results of 14 barges destroyed in 8 patrols with 0 PT boat losses, rather than rejecting the non-authorized modification. The sailors who improvised the first cannon installation at Henderson Field in October 1942 could not have predicted their modification would become standard equipment, solving an immediate problem using available materials, with the innovation succeeding because the problem was real, the solution was practical, and the results were measurable. 800 Japanese vessels destroyed by PT boats with 37mm cannons proved the concept, and PT boats earned their reputation through innovations like the 37mm cannon, the boats themselves not technologically sophisticated, with wooden hulls, gasoline engines, and simple weapons, but what made them effective was crew ingenuity, the willingness to adapt, to improvise, to take salvaged aircraft parts and make them work on boats. That spirit defined PT boat operations throughout the war, Japanese commanders calling PT boats devil boats and green dragons, names reflecting respect earned in combat from PT boats operating at night, attacking from unexpected directions, and destroying supply convoys. The 37mm cannon amplified that effectiveness, giving PT boats offensive capability that matched their tactical mobility.